Hello and welcome to the FMCC webinar, Enabling Positive Experience, Developing and Managing the Buyer-Provider Relationship, presented by Graham Constable. Next slide, please. I do want to let everyone know they have been muted for audio quality. If you do have any questions during this webinar, please feel free to type them into the question box, and we'll go over them during the Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and a copy will be available on the FMCC website, fmcc.ifma.org. Next slide, please. And also, if you do want a PDF copy of this presentation, you can download one now on your control panel. Simply go to the second to last option. It says handouts, expand that box, and you can download and follow along with us. Next slide, please. The FMCC provides many services to the FM community, such as Ask the Expert, Find a Consultant, Locate a Speaker, and online educational resources. You may find more information at their website, fmcc.ifma.org. Next slide. And as always, we like to thank our sponsors. They're a great help to the council. Next slide. And I do want to just bring attention to World FM Day for the whole reason we put together this virtual conference. So we're bringing people, you can go to the next slide, that's fine. And we have presenters during this from all over the world. Prime example is Graham Constable from Australia. And our next presentation will actually be from India. So next slide, please. And this is just a quick snapshot of just a few of the presenters. We have, I think, upwards of 38 or 39 sessions planned over the next 4 days. So I do encourage you, if you have any time available, to sign up and attend as many of our great presentations as possible. Next slide. And at this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to Graham, and he's going to introduce himself.
Thank you, Joshua. As always, we're very fortunate to have you supporting the FMCC, so thank you very much for all your efforts in helping this series of talks and webinars to come to fruition. Good morning, everybody, from a very sunny Sydney. My experience is both strategic and operational, as you can see from my very short bio here. I've hopefully got a very interesting subject to cover with you. Some of the learning objectives that I have here are that you'll get a better understanding of some of the key buyer-provider connects and disconnects. We're going to learn where more value can be added to the buyer-provider relationship, and I'll also look at how we can define a better approach and structure to the buyer-provider relationship. Now, the topics I'm seeking to cover are listed here. I'm going to be using a couple of polls to gauge the audience's experience of buyer-provider relationships. I'm also going to use one or two graphics to support my material that hopefully will paint a picture for you, which leads me to my very first graphic. I would imagine that some of you have come across this type of conversation, perhaps not literally in terms of building a moat, but certainly some of the principles that this particular graphic conveys. And a couple of questions for you just to ponder. Who are you in this particular graphic, and how does this portray some of your similar experiences from a buyer-provider perspective? Now, I mentioned that we have some polls, so let me take you to the first poll. I'd like to ask you, in your experience, what's been the single major reason why a contract has not worked well? Is it the poor performance of the provider, or the poor communication, misaligned interests, unclear expectations up front, or poor governance? So maybe you could take a few minutes just to think about that and let me see some of your answers.
Okay, Graham, 100% said poor communication.
Very interesting indeed. Let me just bring my slides back up. there was a study done by the outsourcing centre, and in there it showed that the buyers' unclear expectations up front, 23% of people who were questioned on this topic said that that was the main reason why a contract failed. And you can see in order where other people's reasons why such failure occurs. And poor communication, interestingly, was down at 11%, but still quite significant. So I'd like to now run through my second poll. And I'm asking here, in your experience, what has been the top buyer-provider disconnect that has created an underwhelming experience for you once they're providing products or services for you? Is it the unclear expectations, relationship behaviors, communications again, or performance and government? I'll just let you take a minute to give me some of your answers there.
Okay, 100% said unclear expectations from either or both parties.
Very interesting. What I'm going to reveal now is a number of slides that show you some of the reasons behind the buyer-provider disconnect. So let me move straight on. So the last poll showed that quite an overwhelming reason was the unclear expectations from either parties. If you look at some of these disconnects, unclear expectations is there, perceptions versus reality, and what we mean by that is there is a disconnect between how one views the relationship and then with how people from both parties behave, and that's manifested in a whole raft of different areas which we'll cover in a few minutes. And perceptions around performance. I know that buyers believe that suppliers aren't performing, whereas that belief is not shared by the supplier or the provider. There are various divergent views on savings. Contractors, providers believe savings occur more often than the clients do, and I think that communication plays a major role there in terms of communicating where those savings actually have been achieved, and certainly on the reporting of those. New ideas. A lot of providers I speak to have a lot of trouble around convincing clients that they do innovate, but I always ask them, well, what do you know of the client's expectations for innovation? Do you know exactly what they want you to innovate on? And again, it's another disconnect. And again, you can see communication in consideration of each other and some of those behaviors, which goes back to the perceptions versus the reality. Some of these hopefully resonate with you in your own experiences. So on the plus side, the outsourcing centre also asked people, what are the things that really work? And you've got here the top 6 from that research, where the relationship is the most important thing rather than performance indicators, and where that focus has existed, the relationship has been very good. Protecting the trust of the buyer and the buyer's proprietary information is very key, certainly amongst those that have answered the questionnaires and the surveys from the buyer's perspective. So the buyers lays great store in providers protecting that trust and that information. Understanding and living the selection and retention criteria of the buyer. I wonder how many of you know that providers go all out to win a contract and then they forget the reasons why they're there and why they've been selected over time. And a number of factors can influence why that happens as well, which we'll cover on shortly. Creating value and moving from business as usual. The buyer is going to be expecting business as usual, but he's going to be expecting more than that. And that's not to say that he wants something for nothing, but he certainly is looking for what they now call these days is relentless improvement, not just continuous improvement, but going that extra mile and understanding the reasons why that extra mile is required. The setting and agreeing of joint expectations, when that's done properly, it leads to a very good relationship, and governing well on both sides and looking for the long term is very important too. So what would add more value? Well, we've already covered that better communication is high on people's lists, and likewise with clear expectations where things aren't unambiguous, or ambiguous rather. Better governance is high, having really good contracts and SLAs, maybe building in extra scope for services for that innovation and creativity, a lot more commitment, and as we go down the scale, the cultural fit, which I often hear as being important, actually hasn't been important when they've done these surveys. I suggest that that would probably come into its fore if all of these others are worked well. So there was an additional survey done around buyer expectations of incumbent providers, because whenever buyers seek to change their provider, that transitioning out of existing providers is all important, but certainly when it comes to reasons for retendering or going to different buyers, these are some of the expectations that buyers have of their existing providers. They've got to definitely present evidence of relevant performance. They've got to prove that they're actually doing what is being expected. The provider needs to understand what the buyer's business goals and strategic priorities are. Without that knowledge of what the buyer's business is, then they're on a path to divergency in terms of providing what the client needs. And I always advise even internal facility management teams that the sooner they understand their client's business needs, the better they're going to be capable of actually showing good performance and providing a good service. Understanding that contract is very important. Going over it with a fine-tooth comb, understanding how it aligns with the client's business goals and objectives, what the KPIs are, what are those key things that the buyer wanted at the tendering stage or at the negotiation stage. How relevant are they still? Do they need to be discussed and changed? And then clarity over how all of those needs will be delivered in that contract. Having those conversations up front and early is very, very important. And clearly when the pricing is done, the provider has got to make sure that it's got the budget to actually fulfill its promises from a pricing perspective. So when we come to looking at the positive experience, turning it from an underwhelming experience to one where people are satisfied with the performance of the provider. Here are some features or factors that I've gained over the years working with both providers and buyers. And the first thing I always ask is, are you demonstrating that you've had an impact on those things that are really important to the client, both from a strategic point of view and from an operational point of view? And if you look back at some of these buyer expectations, how do we demonstrate that we've had an impact in a lot of these areas? That's I found to be very important when I speak with buyers. There needs to be an ongoing review of the performance measures. I've seen contracts that have got literally dozens and dozens and dozens of KPIs, and I've often wondered who's actually going to measure those and who's going to demonstrate that each one of those KPIs is actually working. And I always ponder the relevance of some of the KPIs, and I've seen KPIs that are outcome based, few actually, most of them are in the input or output areas. So There needs to be a mix of all of those three. And there needs to be ongoing conversations, I believe, from my experience, where both the buyer and the provider reviews those performance measures to see how well they're working. Are they, is there an unclear expectation in terms of performance? Are some of the expectations right? Are they fair? So there needs to be that constant discussion around reviewing those performance measures. I mentioned before, knowing, understanding, and very importantly, mapping your client's business priorities. I recommend to a lot of clients that they actually construct a stakeholder map, and they identify within their client organization who the key stakeholders are, what their relationships with each other are, what are their personal goals as well as business goals, what are their roles. So if you can map those out, that gives you a really good understanding of the people systems within the client organization, so you can then understand better business priorities and link them to personal expectations. Often the two can collide, where communication is not good and the relationship starts to unravel. So if you've got that understanding up front, it sets you off on the right path. And then you should really provide, all of your activities should be linked to the client's goals. Where there's a divergence comes from not clearly understanding what the client wants and not having those good communications. So always link your activities to the client's goals, and then find a way of measuring that work and that demonstrate the impact that you're having on those things that are important to the client. And then finally, but obviously not without any mention, is being focused, being willing to change and improve, looking for different ways of satisfying your clients' needs. Client organizations these days, businesses these days, are very, very agile is the term they use these days, where some of those goals change overnight sometimes. And so if you've got a good relationship and you've mapped out goals and you know the key people within the organization, you can constantly check, are we actually enabling your business? What should we be doing that's going to be better for enabling your business? So that's that focus and being willing and able to change as that business changes as well. So with that background, I'm going to share some of the activities and approaches that I've worked on with my clients in the past, and they cover 4 key areas: systems, and that also includes people systems, some of the key metrics, contract structure, and reporting. So let me move on and cover some of those in turn. So in terms of monitoring provider performance, up front, that specification clearly should define the deliverables. There should be no ambiguity around what it is that you want your provider to be providing. And in some cases, if you're able to, work with them in defining what those deliverables are. Usually in a tender situation, you don't get that opportunity, but if you're able to, then I've often recommended that that's done. We've heard the term partnering over the years, but it's still relevant, and I believe that you should be selecting a provider that has that attitude and mentality, and make sure that you meet or speak with some of the key site personnel that are being recommended. Get to know them in the evaluation process. Speaking face-to-face with people will tell you an awful lot. The systems that you have in terms of recording data information really needs to reflect your internal processes. So if you've got a system that doesn't reflect how you work and how you want your information to be reported on, then you need to work very closely with your provider so that you get the right relevant information into your into your data systems, where you can then do your analyzing and synthesizing in terms of what needs to be done further. Your monthly reporting. I've focused on monthly reporting because often that's at the tactical level of reporting. This is where key people meet around the operational side of the business. Quarterly and 6 monthly and annual reporting usually is where you move up the food chain in terms of the levels of governance. But monthly reporting is very critical, and it's a typical frequency of reporting. So define well with your client what it is that you need to report on, or what you want from your provider in terms of reporting, whether they're meeting your expectations. And there are different ways of monitoring performance. There's buyer doing direct monitoring, your provider doing self-monitoring. I'm often asked by clients, look, if we ask our providers to do self-monitoring, then if we then do our own monitoring, what sort of message does that provide? Well, I think there's a good reason for having both, but work with your provider to determine the priorities and the focus on each of those. Joint monitoring, random financial audits is a good way of assessing how well a provider is managing its contract with you, and do some customer surveys, and they can be jointly done. Some of the most effective customer surveys are the ones that are done face-to-face informally as you walk around your client's offices or property. I think that there's a risk of having fatigue in terms of formal customer surveys, but certainly if you've got good relationship with all your stakeholders, those informal discussions, and if you record those, that's a very good way of getting an idea of how well you're working as a provider. Looking at key metrics, some of the key things that I recommend to both buyers and providers is having the monthly report showing how well you're meeting those key metrics. And those metrics have got to be aligned with the specification and the deliverables. As I mentioned before, whenever I've seen hundreds and hundreds of KPIs, they're not actually aligned with meaningful deliverables or parts of the specification. It's almost as if they're put in place because there's a mistrust right from the start, with the potential of a provider meeting your expectations. So I believe that they should be aligned with the specification and the deliverables. There's a number of ways of measurement. There's the balance scorecard, lead and lag indicators, particularly around technical preventive maintenance schedules and minor works. Make the data easily available, have them web-based. Be careful who gets to see the data, but certainly if it's easily accessible, depending on what you want your users to know what's going on, it's very powerful to have that accessibility. On KPIs, when we look at outcomes, they're quite easily to develop and define. But I think that one KPI is often overlooked, possibly because it's difficult to determine how to do it. But I've been working recently with clients trying to get them to look at the effort of a provider, because everybody makes mistakes, and sometimes it might take 1 or 2 times before they get it right. So if you're measuring effort and in 2 or 3 attempts they get it right, then that shows a willingness and a commitment to your deliverables. So I would encourage people to think about measuring effort. It's not easy, but it can be done. And definitely select what is key and mandatory. What are the priority things that you want to measure? And it goes back to the feature where you need to demonstrate that you're actually adding value to the things that are important to the client. So if the buyer is seeing that you're doing that, then what better way than having metrics that are showing that? And then some of the typical metrics that are measured are work health and safety, responses and job completion times for unexpected help desk type transactions, clearly financial, and getting your invoices right that reflect the work that's being done. Moving on to contract structure. Again, we're touching on the clear, concise specifications that really define what it is that you want from your buyer, your provider. The contract model, there's a raft of different models: specialist contractors, managing agents, head contractor, hybrids of these. Best to research these and then choose one that's going to reflect your own business maturity and culture. I've advised businesses on that. Don't go for something that's overcomplicated if you don't have the people within your organization that can manage that. It goes back to that governance topic that we spoke about earlier. And in terms of the relationship, are you seeking to have a traditional type relationship, buyer-provider relationship, where maybe the contract is not complex, or are you looking for something that's much more collaborative in terms of agreeing behaviors and what the deliverables are and how you're going to work and dispute resolution processes? So on one end of the scale you have a very traditional transactional type relationship, and on the other you've got a complex collaborative framework that defines the way you want to work with your buyer and provider. Pricing structure, they differ from being comprehensive through to management fee, schedule of rates, target costs. Again, they sit well within the types of contract, whether they're complex or simple. Likewise with KPIs and risk rewards. Risk reward equations, I think, best suited for some of the more collaborative and complex type contracts. Simple KPIs with some of the more transactional, traditional type contracts that exist. Duration has a big bearing in terms of provider commitment, particularly if there is performance hooks in terms of increases in fees and additional years added to the contracts. 3 + 1 + 1 is one example. And very importantly, upfront communications. When you've selected your provider, I've advised buyers to have those kick-off workshops, have as many as you need. Start building team, look at team dynamics. After all, the provider is going to be part of your essential team. They're going to be a key part that's going to enable your business. Have those regular stakeholder meetings, and this is where your stakeholder map activity comes in. Look at resolving issues quickly and not being frightened once that trust is built up, and having those difficult conversations around misunderstandings or miscommunications and some of those issues. And then looking at the final one, reporting. I found that every buyer's requirement is different. But what I have said is that it needs to be tied to the contract model. The reporting, the complexity of reporting or level of reporting that you require needs to be tied to the type of contract that you have. If you don't, then that can lead to some of those factors that create those disconnects. And the reporting may vary depending on the performance and the governance model. If there's a sense that there's a dip in performance, then there's an expectation that reporting needs to be increased. So that often is an indicator as to how good that relationship is how many informal reports are required. And this is where you need to set up your minimal level of information that you need in those reports and then match those. So both parties need to conform to that. And I've said to buyers that the provider needs those reports from the buyer too. It needs to be told and given feedback on levels of performance and some of the issues that are not being addressed, even down to regular compliments around performance. So it's a two-way thing in terms of reporting, and if you can agree that level up front between the two parties, it's a good way of setting up that relationship. Now, the reports should be structured around the KPIs, deliverables and expectations clearly, and identify from that minimum level what and how many of those reports are actually going to be required, and stick to that as far as you can. Some of the most effective reporting are the ones that show that executive summary type traffic light indicator of performance, where you have a quick snapshot of how things are going, and then you report on the technical things as addendum. So there are various ways and means of making the reports look better than they often are. And what I mean by that is I've often seen these voluminous reports sitting on shelves that are just not looked at or valued. Don't want to get into that situation, because then there's an awful lot of effort for no return. It certainly doesn't build that relationship. Now, covered quite an amount there in short time. I've got a summary slide here, and what I'm showing on this slide is that all of these different means by which you have a positive experience between the buyer and provider are all important, but you need to identify what the low-hanging fruit might be to begin with. And from my experience, I've summarized where I've seen the scale of importance. So specification and deliverables have tended to be one of the lowest hanging fruit type issues that can be quickly and easily resolved. The next up the list is how you go up that tree is reporting KPIs and incentives, getting those right. And that then, both of those lead into getting that relationship. That's often harder to achieve, but if you've built on the ones below, then you're on a better path for achieving that relationship. And then right at the top, having that right style of contract management, where you're being proactive and engaged in looking how to improve that governance and the management of that relationship. And just have a think about where, in your view and your experience, some of these fruit might hang on your tree. Some of them might be different. But if you can have these conversations between the two parties about where these fruits may be and which ones to address if things do start to unravel, then that's a mature way of addressing some of the issues. I mentioned before that I have a few graphics. Here's another one. Now I've entitled this one called "What Does the Buyer Want?" And if you look at this as analogous to a situation between buyer and provider, here's the buyer up front pulling this wagon with square wheels, and the square wheels to me highlight some of the barriers that we've mentioned in terms of disconnects earlier, and they may be, buyer unclear expectations, it might be misaligned interests, it could be poor governance and communications. Square wheels could represent those divergent views and poor behaviors. But typically the provider at the end, behind the wagon, is pushing the wagon, trying to help the buyer. And in that wagon you see a whole bunch of tires. And for me that could be the baggage of experience, past experience of the relationships that have not been good. So there's this weighty expectation that things might be going wrong. It might be that there's a lot of users that are making lots of demands on the buyer, which are then transmitted back to the provider. And it also could be business competition. There might be competitors of the buyer that are doing a lot better than they are, and so there's that weighty expectation that they need to try and pull and get themselves into a better business situation. So for me, this sums up in my mind some of the experiences that I've had in terms of what the buyer wants. What's the provider doing? Well, after time, often this is the situation where the provider is actually pulling a different way. It's he or she has got different expectations and different expectation in terms of what the buyer wants and how it's demonstrating that it's actually performing. And very quickly, this is the situation that can actually happen. And you've still got those square wheels, and you've still got all of those things weighing down that that buyer. But in this example, you've also got all those tires and expectations and so on that are weighing the provider down. So you're getting them into a situation where you're not going anywhere. Buyer vision. I've got vision here with a capital V because often this is what the buyer starts out with, a view of utopia, or close to. In reality, unless that all of those buyer-provider connects are put in place and all that work that is done up front, this is often what happens. And I've got a small v here because this is what the provider actually sees. So it's not vision in terms of goals and so on, but it's what the provider sees. And there he is, he or she pushing the cart or the wagon, doesn't know where the buyer's going, doesn't understand what the buyer's business is, etc., etc. And we then start seeing all of those disconnects. So one quick way that I'm showing in this graphic is put in a periscope, discuss what the mission is, get them to have a look to see what that buyer vision is, and then you start creating the mechanisms, behaviors for having that joint vision. And I've used both capital V and small v there, joint vision and vision. That effectively is my presentation. I'm open to questions. I don't know if you had any questions so far, Joshua?
Yes, give me 1 second. Hold on, wait. Come on, there we go. Can you provide an example of measuring the effort of the provider?
Yeah, I can give you a bit of background there. I was at a conference once where I was listening to a psychologist, business psychologist, describing how when you compare tasks that are given young boys and young girls, there's no difference in terms of whether the boys do it better or whether the girls do it better, but it's in the actual doing where they found quite a striking difference. So if you look at that example, to answer your question, when the girls don't get it right first or second time or third time, the way that they actually respond to that, if you can call it failure yeah, call it failure, the way that they respond to it is different from the boys from psychological perspective, in that the girls just try again and get on with it, but the boys, after 1 or 2 times, if they're not actually encouraged, they give up. And I asked the question of the business psychologist at the conference about how analogous that was in terms of the buyer-provider situation, and he said it was very germane, because if you're not actually giving a provider the benefits of the doubt that they're actually trying, then they'll pretty soon give up, and then you start along that road of all those disconnects. So measuring effort, there's no cookie cutter set of metrics that I could give you, but all I would say is that you should be aware somehow of understanding that a provider is trying its best to meet your expectations and your deliverables. And I think if you have the right relationship where you have that communication and discussion around maybe some of those KPIs that they're not meeting, either they're not fair or they're not right, or you just need to give that provider a little bit more time and encouragement to actually meet them. And I have met a couple of organizations where they do that without realizing that they're doing it, and the provider is performing very, very well. So that presentation by that psychologist has always stuck in my mind, and I've always tried to encourage my clients to look at effort as well as those outcome and income input measures. Hopefully that's given the person's asked the question a bit of insight as to where that comes from, and maybe some thoughts on how, for his or her particular situation, they might be able to start looking at effort.
Yes, excellent. We have another question that says, does the participation of a purchasing department necessarily muddy the waters of buying and providing?
Again, it's a very good question, and it does. I found examples where the purchasing department is worked in isolation. I know well-respected global companies where bid teams work in complete isolation from the teams that are going to be managing whatever it is that's procured. I've often said that in terms of transitioning and mobilization of contracts, the work starts years in front of even the bid process, because if you're able to understand in advance what your client's business is and what their expectations are, and you build up that relationship, when it comes to a tender, there's no surprises. That buyer, that company will see your name and think, oh yes, we know all about these people, they understand our business. It gives you a better chance. So if you can get your procurement or purchasing department on board as part of that team, where you're communicating with them about the knowledge you have of that business in advance and what their expectations are, you should really work together to put together your response to whatever it is that buyer is asking you to provide, and then it makes it easier then for you to meet those expectations and to actually match what it is that buyer is asking you to do in the first place. So I would encourage a lot closer relationship between operational teams and procurement teams.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. It looks like all the questions we have at the moment. If you don't mind going to the next slide, Graham.
Sure.
Okay. And we just want to remind you, don't forget, we have a slew of other webinars coming your way over the next 4 days. The next one will be the evolution of FM in India. And we look forward to seeing you if you can make that one. Next slide, please. And I just want to remind you, the FMCC does have an app, and it's good for the iPhone and Android phones. So please feel free to download that at iTunes or at Google Play. Next slide. And always, we are looking for volunteers for the FMCC STAG, whether it be a presenter, white paper author, podcast participant, someone who can help promote on social media, etc. We would love to have your input and your volunteerism. Ricardo's information is on this slide. He would be the best person to contact. Next slide, please. And the FMCC does want to make everyone aware of the other councils and communities that are out there in the IFMA community. And they are great sources for information and a great place to reach out to. Next slide. Okay, at this time, this concludes our presentation. Graham, I want to thank you for a great and very interesting presentation. And thank you for your time. Everyone, thank you for attending, and have a great rest of World FM Week.
Pleasure. Thank you, Joshua.
You're welcome. Thank you.